Hi there, BookTube, and welcome to a sad day for me. Sad because having finished Franz Kafka's Amerika, I now have nothing left of Franz Kafka left to read, and that makes me very sad. So, why such a sort of esteem for an author who died at age 40, having published very little? A couple of short story collections and some other short stories in magazines. He wrote 3 novels, all of them uncompleted. So that suggests that we're working off first drafts. Now, even though the sort of fragments of those novels show that he very much edited as he went along, so they're not strictly first drafts, but they're not complete. So in the sense of a complete first draft, none of the 3 books reach that stage. And yet, Franz Kafka is such an important writer, so penetrated the sort of cultural mindset that there's a word Kafkaesque, in his honour to the type of writer he was, that, he made such a contribution. And I put it to you that the word Kafkaesque is used more than Joycean or I'm not even sure if there is one for Samuel Beckett. I mean, there should be if there isn't. So a hugely important writer and hugely important to me personally. So I'm going to talk about all his work, but the focus of it will be on Amerika. But I'm going to start. So in my late teens and early 20s, I read the 2 of the 3 novels, which is The Trial and The Castle. And they're probably the 2 most famous sort of Kafkaesque novels, because they're about sort of faceless bureaucracies, the little man in the system who gets completely ground down and overwhelmed by the faceless bureaucracy. And taking The Trial to begin with, which I did read first, it's the story of Joseph K., a man who's been charged for a criminal offence that he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what the law under which he's been charged is. He doesn't know his judges, and he tries to penetrate this huge faceless bureaucracy to try and find out, what's going on, why he's been charged, why he's been accused. And that's essentially it. I'm not going to talk too much more about it. I'm going to focus more on The Castle. But I think the one problem with The Trial is a problem I have with Orwell's 1984 is that there's no real modulation in it. It is such a sort of overwhelming force that he's up against that he can only ever fail. He can only ever not reach any understanding or the important understanding of what he's facing. And I felt in 1984 it was the same, that even though in 1984 there's sort of snatch moments where that they're having sort of an illicit relationship out of sight of the camera, the totalitarian state is so all-encompassing that it's inevitable he will get caught, and he will be reprogrammed or whatever. And I felt that with The Trial, which is why I think The Castle is a far superior book, even though it's actually less complete and it's more in more fragments. Because what Kafka does so fantastically in The Castle is the swings between hope and despair, both for the main character Kay, but also for you as the reader. I mean, you're utterly sort of swept along, in this sort of, veering from as I say, from hope to despair. So when he's with Frida, who's who he starts a relationship with, there's so tenderly and beautifully written, and you think that she's going to be able to provide him a sort of moral courage to sort of penetrate this, the bureaucracy that he's facing, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you are full of hope for him, and then he gets swatted down, and as he meets the next functionary, and who sort of gives him this huge monologue of what their role is, and you and Kay are none the wiser. How can I? There's no forward movement, even though it's suggested all the time. Hope that he can move forward, and in the end, Frida leaves him and goes with someone else, and that's sort of the ultimate stab to the heart. So the bureaucracy in The Castle is that Kay is a land surveyor who is summoned to a castle for a job. When he gets there, the job doesn't exist. It's a sort of bureaucratic error. And so he goes to stay in the village that the castle governs remotely. and he tried to sort of from there he tries to sort of gain access to someone in the castle who can explain, you know, what's gone on. So he starts as a land surveyor, and in the village he has to take the job of a janitor so he can sort of provide for himself. So it's a real sort of fall in status and fall from grace. And the point about the castle is, of course, castles sort of associated with sort of medievalism, and where the bureaucracy, such as it was the royal court, and, you know, sort of chamberlains and stewards and ladies in waiting and all this sort of stuff. And yet this castle is very much in the modern world of a bureaucracy. So it's very much Kafka sort of, you know, melding the two. So you've got the authority and power of status of a royal court, or, you know, the inhabitants of a castle, a prince or a knight or whatever. And then that power is transferred to the bureaucracy, and in the modern world. So the power is still held in the castle, and everyone else is just sort of a minion. But you know, at least with the sort of the medieval sort of stratification and the hierarchy, everyone knew where they stood. Whereas here in the bureaucracy, you don't know what you're dealing with. You know, it's faceless. You don't know. You don't know who you're supposed to be talking to, and all of that sort of stuff. So I think that the combination, I think the bureaucracy and the sort of its modern transition into sort of the new power source. You know, knowledge is power, and of course Kafka's protagonists don't have any knowledge, therefore they have no power. I think that is better done than in the trial, and I also think, as I say, the emotional sweeps, there's much more modulation within the castle. So that's why I think it's a superior novel. Just as a final note on that, apparently the German word for land surveyor that Kafka uses is a sort of an echo, or possibly even a pun, on the word for messiah. You know, so the land surveyor goes as a putative messiah to entreat with the gods. You know, what's my mission? And the gods, you know, bounce him down to, you're not a messiah. You know, you're a pleb like everyone else. Get back down there. So, and this is one thing about Kafka, and I'm going to post a link in the description box to a very good YouTube video where Will Self talks to two German translators who've translated Kafka's work. And the point is that Kafka in German is very funny, but it's really hard to translate that and get that across in the English translations. I think there are moments of humour, but apparently it's almost sort of non-stop in the original German, and we miss that, and that's a shame. And, you know, I wish I read German. Maybe I you know, if I could read German, I could go back and read them all in the original language and rediscover even more depths to him. So those are the first two novels. And then last year I read the complete short stories. I'd read a lot of the short stories, but I got hold of the complete short stories. And they're fantastic. I mean, stories such as The Metamorphosis, In the Penal Colony, Country Doctor, The Burrow, what else? Those are the main ones. And so, for example, In the Penal Colony, it's basically in a punishment prison, and there's a machine that they've invented so that the people who are being executed by the machine at the point of execution are utterly aware of their guilt, because the machine stamps into their flesh as part of the process of executing them what their crime is. And it's a brilliant concept, and I won't spoil it for you how it sort of ends up, but it's all about guilt and expiation. So there's that. The story of the Burrow. So there's this creature, and Kafka does this a lot in his short stories. There's a lot of stories about creatures, anthropomorphism, to reflect back on humanity. So there's there's one about a dog. There's one about an ape who's sort of tamed to become sort of quite human-like. There's the Burrow. There's the Metamorphosis, of course, where the protagonist is turned into a giant bug. So Kafka does this a lot, and I think part of that is because of a concern with his own body. You know, he was tubercular, so there was sort of that weakness. He was very sort of his father was a sort of great hulking man who I think left Kafka feeling very threatened physically. There's also quite a lot of violence in Kafka, which it's only through reading this book that I've come to to see that in him. So there's a lot of physicality. You know, A Country Doctor, one of the major images is about the wound of the patient that he goes to see, which is sort of crawling with maggots and stuff. It's you know, it's unbelievably well described. So just going back to the Burrow, so there's a creature there who lives underground and has built this sort of amazingly intricate sort of fortification so that, you know, it's protected. And then it starts hearing a noise, and then it sort of starts to wonder, you know, is this a predator? And the architectural description of the Burrow is very, very sort of detailed by Kafka. And what you realise is that, you know, this creature is alone. You know, that scratching can be a predator, it could be a mate, or it could be just another one of his species doing the same thing, you know, because they're hardwired into this is making its own burrow. And you don't know which of the three it is, but if you think about it, if he is so hermetically sealed in his burrow for protection, how is he ever going to find a mate? How is a mate ever going to break through and sort of reproduce? And it's a stunningly simple idea. The metamorphosis is a classical Oedipal tale. Again, returns to this theme of Kafka and his father being dominated by him. And, you know, Kafka actually wrote a letter to his father where he sort of explains a lot of these things, but he never sent it to his father. He was too much of a coward. But Metamorphosis is, to me, the best short story I've ever read. It's just stunning. It verges on novella length, but it's just supreme. Where, you know, one day Gregor Samsa wakes up to discover he's been metamorphosized into a giant bug, and it takes off from there. And it's all about the family dynamics of them, sort of, you know, rejecting him versus love. He feels guilty because he can't go up to his job, which means that he's not bringing the income to the family that they need, and all this sort of stuff. It's just brilliant. A Country Doctor, which I've mentioned, starts off with a scene of sort of violence against the Doctor's maid, sort of implied violence. She's going to be sexually assaulted, and that's sort of contrasted with the sort of power and puissance of the horses of his carriage that are being sort of yoked up to the carriage so he can go on this call out he's had in the country. And it's about God, it's about salvation. It's just a lot of Kafka's short stories are sort of allegorical or parables. They do sort of slightly smack of sort of Old and New Testament. That's just another sort of layer of Kafka's sort of genius. So those are the short stories. I will say that having read those in particular beforehand, or most of them, that the rest in the collection didn't really add anything, I felt. You know, there are a lot of solid ones. There's one called The Mouse Folk, about, again, anthropomorphized, about a community of mice, and one of them has this beautiful voice, and she becomes a singer and becomes almost like sort of goddess-like, such is the reverence given to her. And in the end, there's a fall from grace. A bit like the story of the Hunger Artist in the collection, where a guy, what he does is he's part of a circus sideshow, and he starves himself for 40 days as an act, carnival act, and as times change and people's tastes change, he's less and less popular is his act, and in the end he ends up in sort of, you know, a sort of straw cage, treated like an animal in the circus, right, sort of stuff right at the back, because no one passes by to see, you know, to come and see his show. They'll go and see animals or whatever in the circus, and gradually you realise he explains what his motive, you know, why he can do these great fasts, and you know, it's not a noble profession that he practices. It's for very sort of banal reasons that he has this sort of great talent, even though the talent is no longer seen as a talent. But as I say, other than those sort of headline stories, which, you know, are the ones you're probably most familiar with, I didn't feel the smaller vignettes really add anything. And there's one or two stories that I don't think particularly are great. There's the Great Wall of China, which is a very well known one, but it didn't do a lot for me. Anyway, so that's the short story. So now we come to Amerika. Now, the first thing to say about this is that Kafka, as a work in progress, didn't call it Amerika. He called it the Man Who Disappeared. And in case you don't know, that on his, in his will or on his deathbed or whatever, he charged his literary executor, Max Brod, who was a friend of his, saying, "Burn all my work. I don't want any of it to survive me." And if Brod had carried that out, then we wouldn't have had any Kafka. But fortunately, Brod ignored it. And Brod did a lot of the work to make the novels publishable. He sort of ordered the fragments and things like that. But Brod also sort of was an editor, and he didn't call this. The reason it's called America is thanks to Brod, not Kafka. And I think it's really important, I don't know if you can see this, that it's America with a K, not as we spell it in English, America with a C. Because Kafka never left Central Europe in his lifetime. He never visited America. So this, putatively, this is an America of Kafka's imagination. He did have relatives who lived there. So we know Kafka was a great letter writer. So he would have had letters probably with sort of sounds and colour of America from his relatives, but he himself never experienced it firsthand. So this book isn't about America at all. It's about Middle Europe, America. It's like Middle Europe in America, or in a notional America, and that returns to the title of The Disappeared Man, because I think the thing about this book is it's looking back at his own country of Czechoslovakia as it was then, in exile, or wanting to be able to look at it from a position of exile. And the reason is because Kafka felt an exile in his own country. He was part of the German ethnic and language minority of Czechoslovakia, because most were Czech-speaking. He was Jewish, which meant that he was a minority there. So I think he always felt as an exile. And in a very good biography of Kafka by the Italian Pietro Citati, I think he sort of suggests that Kafka was sort of fairly ethereal character in real life. If you read the letters that he sent to the 3 or 4 women in his life, that he, was one of them he was going to marry, and in the end he was so chicken shit that he just kept putting it off until in the end she broke it up, because he was too weak to do it himself. And there is a sense of these sort of relationships are sort of idealised through letters. I'm sure they were physical, but it's almost as though they were beyond physical. They were just sort of all up here in the mind and stuff. And Citati captures that very, very well. And obviously all the stuff about sort of feeling exiled and if you're in exile, Kafka wasn't actually in exile. He was exiled at home. So the normal thing about exile, when you look back at your home country, there's yearning, what you've left behind, the people, the countryside, and all that stuff. But equally, what are the reasons for your exile? If you've been forced into exile, there's also, as much as you love your country, it's a country that turned against you and forced you out. Well, none of that was real for Kafka. It was an internal exile within his own country. And so there's an interesting dynamic as to all the characters are European. There are no Americans in this. There are some crass mistakes, like there's a bridge for linking New York and Boston. Well, I've done that journey on an Amtrak train and it took me 4 hours. So that'd be one hell of a bridge. The Statue of Liberty is not shown holding the torch. Kafka describes her as holding a sword, which I think is a confusion with the Lady Justice statue that's on top of the Old Bailey, which is the main court in the UK, Court of Justice in the UK. So there's lots of mistakes about that. All the characters are European, transposed to this notional America for whatever reasons Kafka had in order to be able to look back at his own culture. There's a character called Brunhilde, which presumably is a deliberate echo of Brunhilde from a Wagnerian opera. But, the Brunhilde in here is described as a singer, and we presume an opera singer. But she's not a warrior. She's not a Valkyrie character. She's this sort of huge mound of flesh who has to be sort of carted around. And she's the diva part of an opera singer, but she's not she doesn't enflesh the opera character of a Valkyrie. And so this is what I'm saying. This has nothing to do with America, really. So it starts off where the character Karl Rossmann, who's a German lad of either 16 or 17, because he's referred to as both within the novel, He is exiled from home and sent to New York by his parents for some indiscretion with an older maid who he has sired a child with. And that's all you're given. You know, he's banished from Eden. He's banished from the family home, sent to the other side of the world, to America. And the book starts off with the ship is docking and he's going to disembark. And he realises he's left his umbrella in his cabin. So he goes back, as the ship's pretty much emptied out, he goes back to retrieve his umbrella. And he's left his suitcase with an old man that he sort of met on the ship. So he's trusting that, you know, it's not going to get stolen. And the ship, in a way, is a bit like the castle and a bit like the trial. You know, it's sort of bewildering architecture. And he gets lost. He can't find his room. But he hooks up with a stoker from the crew who is on his way to get his pay as he's going to leave the ship and look for, you know, his next berth. And they get talking, and the stoker has a chip on his shoulder about one of his fellow crewmen that in talking to Rossmann, he decides that he's going to air his grievances to the purser and the ship's captain when he picks up his money. So Rossmann accompanies him, and they go to the captain's, well, it's not a cabin, it's more of an office on the boat. And there's quite a crowd scene in there because the purser's there, the captain's there. There's some visitors from the land, including an elderly gentleman who turns out to be an American senator. So he asks for his money, but then he starts complaining about the behaviour of this other guy, who then turns up. And what it develops into is a court scene, you know, an impromptu hearing. And it's the stoker who's on trial, not the guy that he wants to accuse. And what Kafka is really skillful at is these sort of set pieces. He's a fantastic choreographer in terms of who says what, who reacts to what, who's feeling what, and whatever physical movement there is. And the interesting thing here is that Karl, he's not really formally part of this process because he's not a member of the ship's crew. But as a passenger, he's afforded a certain respect and status. And Karl decides to advocate on behalf of the stoker because they've sort of made friends and the stoker's not very articulate. And Karl is the only one in the entire hierarchy of this sort of hearing who's free to move around the room. Everyone else has a sort of fixed position. And it's a real sort of bravura set piece. You know, there's lots and lots of detail, particularly in their reactions and them thinking what they can and can't say in terms of being disrespectful and what their position in the hierarchy is. And that's really the first major scene of the book. And in fact, it was actually published as a short story, a standalone short story. And it's at the end of this that Karl realises that the senator is actually his uncle who he's been sent to. So there's a bit of a sort of fortunate sort of meeting that's how he found his man. So his uncle takes him off and sets him up in his home and buys a piano for him and organises English lessons. But Karl's really a bit of a prisoner in here because his uncle sets quite an onerous regime. And they end up falling out, although Karl doesn't realise it, because he is invited by one of the uncle's business partners and friends to spend an evening at his house where he has a young, same age as Karl, daughter. And you have this is a very strange scene, a very alienating scene, because you have a sort of a set piece meal around the table, which Karl is quite out of his depth in, because a lot of it is sort of business chat and stuff. And at the end of it, he goes to visit the daughter because she wants him to play piano for her, and that turns into quite a scene of violence where she basically beats him up. And so he's desperate to leave there, but he's called back to, he's lost something. He needs to find his hat before he can leave. And in doing so, he ends up back in the sort of the dining room where the other business partner friend of his uncle, who's turned up to this meal uninvited, delivers a message from the uncle which basically says, "That's it, you disobeyed my orders, you're not going to be back in time for your English lesson, you're out, you're on your own." And that's it. It's a brutal, He's been ejected from home, sent to the other side of the world. He's been put in the care of this uncle. Seems to have all set up. And then his uncle, sort of expels him as well for there's a sort of echo of the Garden of Eden here, but you're not quite, the so-called sin is not as at home, being seduced and sorring a child. That's pretty obvious, but here it's not clear what the sin of, what is the equivalent of eating an apple, is. So Cole basically is thrown out, and he meets two characters on the road called Delamarche, who's a Frenchman, and Robinson, who's an Irishman, who have a bit of the sort of Vladimir and Estragon from Beckett's Waiting for Godot about them. There's a bit of a sort of comedy thing going on, but there's also an undercurrent of violence about the two, because Cole, don't forget, Cole's only 16 or 17. And he's very worried about his suitcase because these two guys have no possessions. Robinson only has a jacket, doesn't have a shirt under it. So he's very worried that they're sort of after his sort of secret stash of money and his suitcase and stuff. And he's desperate to leave as soon as he can. But they are significant figures who permeate the novel, and he keeps sort of ending up back with them. I'll come back to that in time. Anyway, so he sort of takes his first opportunity to leave them and goes to a hotel, ostensibly because they've asked him to bring food back for them. And he sort of goes to this buffet in the hotel, and it's mad. There's sort of people surging towards the food and stuff, and it's very alienating to him because one of the things about this book, and the only thing that's possibly American, are crowd scenes. America is sort of bigger, more populated, more frenetic crowds. There's stuff about politics in the book, which I'll come to. There's a scene about a political election candidate who's addressing a crowd. There's the traffic, which is frenetic. He has to make his way through traffic at various points. So I think crowds are the only sort of American element that Kafka sort of really hones in on. But anyway, he's taken under the wing of the head cook, who's an old woman who comes from the same country as he does. And she says, look, we'll get you a job here. Come back tomorrow. Go and take the food to your pals, but come back tomorrow and we'll set you up with a job here as the lift boy, which is sort of the lowest job in the hotel. And he's very excited by this because it seems to offer him an opportunity. And she is a mother figure. So he's been expelled from the family home, he's been expelled from his uncle, and here's a sort of a proxy mother who takes him under her wing. So next day he goes back, he gets the job, he's given a uniform, he's in the dormitory with all the other lift boys, and it seems to be working. And the head cook has a secretary, a female secretary, called Teresa, who he strikes up a friendship with. And what I find slightly odd in this, it's a non-sexual relationship. She's very vulnerable and very needy, and it's sort of implied that she wants a relationship with him, but he maintains it as a friend, possibly because he's feeling a bit chastened having the experience of the maid back home. I don't know, but anyway, inevitably he falls foul of a set of circumstances, which means he sort of neglects his post in the lift, and he is hauled up in front of a hearing with the head waiter, who is responsible for all the sort of junior staff, and the head porter, who has a set of grievances against Cole, which are unrelated to his dereliction of his post, but just his own sort of dislike of Cole. And then the head chef comes down to defend him, to be his advocate. So what you had with the stoker, where Cole was the free agent, not really, no responsibilities within the scenario, here is he's front and centre of it. He's on trial. And it's fantastically choreographed. The movements of the head chef, the head waiter, the head cook, various sort of witnesses that are brought in or happen to stop by. And it's a fantastic scene, and the upshot is he loses his job, so he's expelled again, and this time it's not his mother figure, his proxy mother figure expelling him, but he's expelled, and wouldn't you know it, but he runs into Delmarche and Robinson again. The reason he left his post is because Robinson turns up in the hotel drunk, very drunk, And what Karl does is an act of mercy, which is basically takes him up to the dormitory so he can sleep it off. But in that time, he's discovered away from his post. So Karl really has no choice but to sort of go back with Delmarche and Robinson, where they've struck it lucky. They have moved in with a diva who's divorced from her husband, but she's very, very rich. This is Brunelda. And basically they're exploiting her. They're ripping her off for her money. But the problem for Karl is he's sunk even further in terms of his status. So in the Stoker story, he had respect as a passenger, customer, effectively, of the ship line. In the hotel, he was the bottom rung in the hotel, but he had aspirations. He was studying sort of business books and at night to sort of try and get higher up the ladder. But here, Delmarche sort of says, "Oh, you've got to be our servant," which is one step up from being a slave. So he's sunk from lift boy to servant. And again, it's violent because he tries to escape. He says, "No, I'm going to be your servant." Tries to escape, but he can't because there's two of them against one of him. And it's quite shocking violence perpetrated on him, really. And it goes back to his initial fears when he first met them, that, these two guys, I don't trust them, or whatever. So what at this stage, I don't know quite when the phrase "the American dream" was sort of, first hatched, and also when it sort of reached Europe as a notion. But this is an inverse of the American dream because, as I say, he's continually sliding in his status. And he's ended up one step above slave. And I'm not even sure if Kafka is not saying he is a slave, or, he's about to be a slave. And that's unfortunately where the narrative runs out, and you only have sort of fragments thereafter. And there's two fragments. There's one where he's moving Brunelda out of the flat, sort of almost in a wheelbarrow, but it's not quite as bad as that. So he's sort of giving her liberation, but we're not sure to what purpose. And then that's quite a short fragment. And the second fragment is he applies for a job where it's basically it's called the Oklahoma Theatre Company. It's not in Oklahoma, they're on tour recruiting. And they basically sort of promise a job for anyone who applies. And he says, "Oh, I'm going to be, I could be an actor." And this is where it gets difficult because it is a sort of a fragment and you can't quite see how it fits into the rest of the novel. For me, it was very rich in association because even though it's a theatre company, it's very bureaucratic in terms of how he has to sort of go up to various departments, what type of job do you have your papers, etc., etc. And all I could think of was, this is people signing up, to be, to get their yellow star, to go into the Jewish ghetto and eventually to be carted off to the concentration camps. Obviously, that's anachronistic because this book was written, Kafka died before the Second World War, so we wouldn't have known any of that. But that's what the imagery conjured up for me because even though it's a theatre company, it was very bureaucratic. And it's very strange. And I've seen it suggested that actually this is hell, the afterlife, that he's sort of, it's not real. So it's very rich in those sorts of associations. And that's the book. And why I come back to what it was called, Amerika, but it's not Amerika. Kafka called it The Man Who Disappeared. And Karl Rossmann does disappear in this book in the sense that he's stripped gradually of status. He loses his suitcase, he loses his money, he's literally only in the clothes that he stands in. So he does disappear. And I think that's what Kafka was exploring in himself. That's why he had to write a book as if he was in exile, which is this, Kafka's the man who disappeared because Kafka, in this etherealness, didn't feel grounded in our world, didn't feel part of it. And this is very different to the trial and the castle. It has more in common with some of the short stories, I think. But it's great. It's different but great. And Kafka is just, the word Kafkaesque is associated with the sort of, a baroque, impenetrable, opaque sort of bureaucracy, nightmarish, trying to navigate your way around. But Kafka is so much more than that. That's almost a reductive term. There is a lot about sort of salvation, about exile, being exiled from yourself. There's a lot about the human body. There's a lot about the sort of the casual violence of this book is absolutely about relationships in power. there's a line towards the end where he goes, even people with not much power will still wield it over the people who have even less than them. And Kafka's very astute on that, and obviously that underlies the faceless bureaucracies. And I just want to return to the election scene in this. Kafka lived in the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so an emperor, and as I say, the medieval castle bureaucracy has got to adapt to become, the bureaucracy that can serve a whole empire. Austria-Hungary ruled over, parts of what we now, became Yugoslavia, the Czech Republic, and all these other countries. So it was an empire, and it needed and one of the reasons it failed is because it was too antiquated and didn't have a sort of responsive bureaucracy. And I think Kafka here is saying, yeah, we all know how terrible empires are, and Kafka himself was the victim of an imperator, which is his own father, who was effectively an emperor over him, lording it over him. So Kafka doesn't like. I don't think Kafka likes empires and likes the imperial sort of authority, but I don't think he's particularly keen on democracy as he saw it either. He's not favourable towards the scene about the election in America. And one thing America represents is it's not an empire. It's not ruled over by an emperor. It is a democracy. But I think for Kafka, he associates democracy with bureaucracies and facelessness of the trial and the castle, even though they are recognisably within a sort of Middle Europe empire setup. I think Kafka feels that democracy would demand a bureaucracy in order to execute the laws of the democracy, because it's not the people at the top, the politicians, the prime ministers who are enacting. They may pass the laws, but they're not putting them into practice. That needs a civil service. That needs a bureaucracy. And I think Kafka fears that, democracy is just as bad in a different way, because it just engenders these faceless bureaucracies that crush us all anyway. At least with an emperor, you know who to aim your bile and spite at, maybe even one day try and assassinate, as occasionally happened. But who do you target in a bureaucracy? Who do you target in a democracy? There's no one. And I think that's a really interesting political side of Kafka that I don't think gets talked about all that much. So there you have it. Franz Kafka, Amerika, and his other works. And I feel bereft because I'm so beholden to Kafka as a writer. Even though I write nothing like him, I just think he's one of a kind and a supremely important man of ideas as well as literary style. And as I say, I'm sad that I have nothing else to read about him now. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.